investigators faced a forensic nightmare. Millions of fragments scattered across farms, forests, and rooftops, the largest crime scene in British history. Scottish police, the FBI, and intelligence agencies from more than a dozen countries began an unprecedented effort to rebuild Pan Am Flight 103. Literally, piece by painstaking piece. In an aircraft hangar at RAF Longtown, twisted aluminum was laid out like a jigsaw puzzle from hell. And slowly, a pattern emerged. The aircraft had been destroyed by a bomb, not by structural failure. Welcome to Threat Level Red. I'm your host, Charles Denyer, and tonight, terror over Scotland. The Pan Am Flight 103 bombing over Lockerbie. A single act of terror that turned the sky into a weapon, erased 270 lives in seconds, and left behind a case so entangled in politics, intelligence, and grief that more than 3 decades later, the truth still feels just out of reach.
Welcome to Threat Level Red, a Charles Denyer Productions podcast. Every week, Charles brings his real-world expertise to the front lines of America's most pressing threats. Cyber attacks, extremist networks, rogue states, terrorism, economic instability, systemic breakdowns, and so much more. From the digital battleground to the streets of America, no threat is left uncovered. No spin, no filters, just intel.
At 7:03 p.m. on Wednesday, December 21st, 1988, a sudden violent sound tears through the night over Lockerbie, Scotland. A roar so out of place it feels almost geological, as if the sky itself has ruptured. Almost immediately, the darkness is punctured by flashes, then by debris falling from above. What is happening cannot yet be seen or understood. High overhead, an aircraft has already been torn apart, scattering wreckage across the countryside in a silent, widening arc of destruction. Then the ground explodes. Entire structures vanish. Streets cease to exist. Families are killed instantly. Lives interrupted mid-evening, just days before Christmas, with no warning and no chance to escape. At 31,000 feet, Pan Am Flight 103, a Boeing 747 on a transatlantic flight, has been ripped from the sky. All 259 passengers and crew are killed immediately, 190 of them Americans. Before the night is over, 11 more people on the ground will be dead. Wreckage falls across hundreds of square miles of countryside, transforming fields and neighborhoods into a vast, silent debris field. Soon, one conclusion begins to take shape. This was no mechanical failure, no accident of fate. This was a deliberate act of terrorism. A barbaric, heinous act that would become known as the Lockerbie bombing, the deadliest terrorist attack in the history of the United Kingdom. And soon, the story hardens into something deceptively simple. A Libyan bomb, hidden in a radio cassette player, placed in checked luggage. One man convicted, one nation blamed, justice officially served. But beneath that clean narrative lies decades of unanswered questions, missing evidence, compromised investigations, intelligence politics, and grieving families who still don't agree on who was truly responsible. Before Lockerbie, before the fireball, before the headlines, and before a small Scottish town became shorthand for terror, the world was already leaning toward catastrophe. The late 1980s felt deceptively calm. The Cold War was loosening its grip. Summits were broadcast on television, and there was talk, hopeful talk, of a world finally moving beyond decades of East-West hostility. But beneath the surface, anger and unresolved conflicts still burned. Terrorism had become a deliberate instrument of pressure, and civilian targets, especially air travel, were increasingly in the crosshairs. This was not random violence. It was meant to be seen, felt, and understood. In June 1985, that reality was laid bare by the hijacking of TWA Flight 847. A commercial airliner was seized by Hezbollah militants shortly after takeoff. Its passengers held captive for 17 agonizing days as the aircraft was shuttled between airports in the Middle East. As negotiations dragged on, the hijackers singled out U.S. Navy diver Robert Stepham. He was beaten, shot, and his body dumped onto the tarmac in Beirut as a deliberate display of power and defiance. He was only 23 years old. The message was unmistakable. This was not just a hijacking for leverage. It was a public execution carried out on a civilian airliner, broadcast to the world. Aviation had become a stage for political terror, and the passengers aboard were no longer just hostages, but instruments in a brutal campaign meant to intimidate governments and command global attention. Only months later, the danger spread beyond the aircraft themselves. In December 1985, coordinated attacks struck the airports in Rome and Vienna as armed militants opened fire and threw grenades into crowded terminals, killing 19 civilians and wounding more than 100 others before security forces intervened. Together, these attacks sent an unmistakable message. Nowhere in the machinery of global travel, from the terminal to the sky, was beyond reach. Terrorism had fully embedded itself into the rhythms of civilian life. And to make matters worse, by the late 1980s, commercial aviation was a gilded cage with the door left wide open, and anyone could walk through it. By today's standards, in a post-9/11 world, airport security was terrifyingly inadequate. Checked baggage often traveled without its owner, hopping between flights, routed through multiple terminals, and rarely scrutinized beyond a glance at a tag. And baggage reconciliation was highly inconsistent, even chaotic, as flights would routinely depart without confirming that every bag matched its passenger. Furthermore, screening technology offered little real protection, as metal detectors often failed to catch weapons, and X-ray machines showed only crude outlines, often unable to distinguish a harmless object from something deadly. Even more troubling was the fact that pilots and flight attendants were often subject to minimal security screening, effectively allowing them to carry nearly anything onto an aircraft without question. An explosive hidden inside everyday items, radio cassette players, briefcases, boxes, or even shoes, well, they could pass through airport screening completely unnoticed. There was no advanced chemical detectors, no bomb-sniffing dogs systematically deployed, no layered security protocols, just trust, assumption, and procedure. In other words, the tools and systems designed to protect millions of passengers were cracked and wide open, leaving airlines incredibly vulnerable to catastrophic attacks. In a world already roiled by international tension, terrorism, and retaliation, planes were flying coffins waiting to be exploited. Every unchecked suitcase, every faulty X-ray, every overlooked procedure created a potential death sentence thousands of feet high up in the skies. The stage for tragedy had been meticulously prepared, and no one realized just how fragile the system truly was. In June 1985, Air India Flight 182 was destroyed by a bomb planted in checked luggage, killing all 329 people aboard. The parallels to Pan Am 103 were chilling as investigators openly discussed the vulnerability of international baggage systems in the years that followed. Meanwhile, geopolitics were highly combustible during this time period. In April 1986, President Reagan ordered the bombing of Libya in retaliation for the Berlin discotheque attack. Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi publicly threatened revenge. 2 years later, in July 1988, the U.S. Navy shot down Iran Flight 655, killing all 290 civilians. Iran called it a massacre. The U.S. called it a tragic mistake. Iranian officials spoke openly of retaliation, a fact reported at that time by the BBC and Reuters. This is where motive becomes murky and dangerous. Multiple intelligence services warned that U.S.-flagged aircraft were potential targets. Pan Am, in particular, symbolized American power, wealth, and global reach. To attack Pan Am was to strike at the very heart and soul of the United States itself. So here's the question that refuses to go away. In a world saturated with warnings, precedents, and unresolved vendettas, was Pan Am Flight 103 flying into a death trap already set? And if so, who knew? December 21st, 1988, a Wednesday, days before Christmas. Pan Am Flight 103 began its journey in Frankfurt, Germany, aboard a 727, designated Flight 103A. That plane carried passengers and their luggage to London Heathrow, where everything would transfer, people, suitcases, parcels, to a larger Boeing 747 for the main transatlantic leg to New York City. At 6:25 p.m., the Boeing 747, known as the Clipper Maid of the Seas, lifted off from Heathrow. On board, 243 passengers, 16 crew members, college students heading home for the holidays, including 35 from Syracuse University, families, business travelers, a honeymooner, even a U.S. intelligence team quietly returning stateside. Everything felt routine, mundane, almost ordinary, until 38 minutes later, when the plane reached cruising altitude over southern Scotland. At 7:03 p.m., at 31,000 feet, the aircraft was torn apart by a ferocious explosion in the forward cargo hold. The cockpit separated instantly. The nose section plummeted almost vertically into a field near the village by the name of Tundergarth. The rest of the fuselage disintegrated, scattering wreckage and human remains across 845 square miles. The wings, still carrying thousands of gallons of jet fuel, spiraled downward and struck Sherwood Crescent, a residential street in the small, quiet town of Lockerbie, Scotland. The impact obliterated homes. 11 residents on the ground were killed instantly. Entire families vanished. One witness later told the BBC it felt like the sky had come down. First responders arrived to absolute chaos beyond imagination. Burning suitcases raining down, passports, children's toys, letters, human remains, all scattered for miles. Many victims were never found intact, and some identified only years later through advanced forensic techniques. Yet, amid the horror, there was compassion. Lockerbie residents opened their homes to grieving families. Churches became temporary morgues. Volunteers worked shoulder to shoulder with investigators in freezing rain, collecting debris, piece by piece. Within hours, authorities ruled out mechanical failure. This was no accident. Blast patterns and wreckage deformation pointed clearly to a bomb. Soon, one fact was undeniable. This was an act of terrorism. But another question loomed, heavier than the smoke still rising over Lockerbie. Who did this and why? Because the night Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over Lockerbie was only the beginning. When the fires cooled over Lockerbie, the real work began. Not arrests, not accusations, but collection of debris and then reconstruction. Investigators faced a forensic nightmare. Millions of fragments scattered across farms, forests, and rooftops, the largest crime scene in British history. Scottish police, the FBI, and intelligence agencies from more than a dozen countries began an unprecedented effort to rebuild Pan Am Flight 103, literally piece by painstaking piece. In an aircraft hangar at RAF Longtown, twisted aluminum was laid out like a jigsaw puzzle from hell. And slowly, a pattern emerged. Burn residue, microscopic scarring, metal edges bent outward in a way that pointed to a powerful internal detonation in the forward cargo hold. The conclusion, shared by both British and American investigators, was unmistakable. The aircraft had been destroyed by a bomb, not by structural failure. Then came the fragment, a sliver of green circuit board, no larger than a fingernail. Labeled PT-35B, forensic analysis identified it as part of an MST-13 electronic timer, a model manufactured by the Swiss firm Mabo and sold critically to Libyan intelligence in the mid-1980s. This was the very timer alleged to have been used to actually trigger the bomb that destroyed Pan Am Flight 103. This tiny component became the backbone of the prosecution's case. Investigators theorized the bomb was concealed inside a Toshiba radio cassette player, packed in a suitcase, loaded at Malta, transferred through Frankfurt, and ultimately placed aboard Flight 103 at Heathrow without the passenger ever boarding the plane. But this is where the certainty begins to wobble, as the chain of custody for key evidence was extremely complex. The timer fragment was recovered months after the crash. Some forensic conclusions relied on expert testimony later challenged by defense teams and independent reviewers. Even the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission years later would identify what they called a miscarriage of justice that may have happened, citing concerns over evidence interpretation and witness reliability. None of this means the bomb didn't exist, because it most certainly did. But it raises a crucial question. When evidence is rare, geopolitical pressure immense, and answers demanded fast, How solid does a case need to be before it becomes history? Because once this narrative took shape, there was no turning back. Justice for Lockerbie would not come quickly. It would come 13 years later, in a courtroom unlike any other the world has ever seen. In May 2000, a Scottish criminal court convened, not in Scotland, not in the United States, but on neutral ground at Camp Zayist, a former U.S. airbase in the Netherlands. This legal experiment was the product of years of diplomatic deadlock with Libya, sanctioned isolation, and UN-brokered compromise. In the dock sat Abdel Bassat el-Megrahi, a Libyan intelligence officer and former airline security chief. Along him, Alamin Fahima, also accused of participating in the plot. No jury, 3 Scottish judges, one of the most complex terrorism prosecutions in modern history. The prosecution's case was built on a sequence of conclusions drawn from the evidence. Megrahi, they argued, purchased clothing in Malta that was later packed around the bomb. The bomb was hidden inside a Toshiba radio cassette player. A timer linked to Libyan intelligence triggered the explosion. And a suitcase containing this device began its journey from Malta to Frankfurt, then to London, and finally into the dark, ominous skies over Lockerbie. Central to this narrative was Tony Gauci, a Maltese shopkeeper who testified that Megrahi resembled the man who bought the clothes. But Gauci's identification evolved over time. He failed to identify Megrahi in earlier photo lineups and only made a positive identification years later, after extensive media exposure. His testimony would later be called problematic by legal reviewers. On January 31st, 2001, the judges delivered a split verdict. Megrahi was convicted of 270 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 27 years. As for Fahima, he was acquitted, returning home and landing to a triumphant welcome at Tripoli airport, even being embraced by Libya's iron-fisted ruler, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. Even then, doubts lingered. 2 judges described the case as circumstantial. As for Megrahi, he consistently maintained his innocence as international legal observers noted the absence of direct evidence tying him to the bomb's construction or placement. As for Gaddafi, he had this to say.
I will speak on Monday, Colonel Gaddafi said, but when I speak, the judges will have 3 choices: resign, tell the truth, or commit suicide.
So here's the unsettling question. If 2 men were charged with the same crime on the same evidence, why did one walk free while the other would die branded the world's most infamous terrorist? And what does that say about certainty? For a time, the Lockerbie case seemed closed. Libya accepted responsibility in a carefully worded diplomatic agreement. A staggering $2.7 billion was paid to victims' families by the Gaddafi regime. Governments moved on, but history has a way of reopening files, especially when things just don't seem to add up. And so, the first cracks in this horrific act of terror appeared in the evidence itself. At the center was the MST-13 timer fragment, the tiny piece of circuitry that linked the bomb to Libya. Defense lawyers and independent experts questioned its chain of custody, noting it was discovered months after the crash and handled by multiple agencies. And how about Mabo's owner, Edwin Bollier, who later claimed under oath that similar timers had been supplied to other entities, statements that became increasingly controversial over time. Investigators and journalists suggested that Bollier may have had business relationships with East German state organizations connected to the Stasi, as well as contacts within Western intelligence circles, though Bollier consistently denied such links. As his testimony evolved, marked by partial retractions, clarifications, and renewed assertions, the uncertainty surrounding his accounts only deepened. These unresolved questions, combined with Mabo's opaque dealings with security-related clients, fueled lasting doubts about who had access to the timers and whether intelligence agencies, rather than isolated individuals, were part of the broader supply network. Then there was the witness, Tony Gauci. He was the Maltese proprietor of Mary's House, a clothing store in Malta, who received financial rewards from a U.S. Justice Department program designed to compensate informants. The existence of payments reported by The Guardian, a major UK news outlet, and confirmed by U.S. officials, was not disclosed to the defense at trial, a point the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission later cited as potentially significant. Gauci's identification of McGrahy, already inconsistent, now appeared compromised. And what about the timeline? Well, several intelligence assessments suggested the bomb may have been introduced at Heathrow, not Malta, contradicting the prosecution's core theory. A classified CIA report, later summarized in court proceedings, acknowledged alternative bagging loading scenarios. This opened the door to older, uncomfortable questions. Was the attack retaliation for Iran Air Flight 655? Was a Palestinian militant group involved? Were geopolitical considerations quietly shaping which leads were pursued and which were abandoned? These theories are supported by various intelligence reporting, but they remain unproven and are still contested. In 2007, the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission even concluded that McGrahy's conviction might constitute a miscarriage of justice, a rare and serious finding. A second appeal was granted. It would never be heard as McGrahy was released on compassionate grounds in 2009 and died in 2012, still proclaiming innocence to his very last day on Earth. So here's the question that refuses to stay buried. If the official story cannot withstand scrutiny, are we protecting justice or preserving closure? On August 20th, 2009, a single decision reignited the Lockerbie fire. Abdelbasset al-Megrahi, convicted, vilified, and terminally ill, was released from a Scottish prison on compassionate grounds. Why? Because he was diagnosed with advanced prostate cancer and given months to live. Scottish Justice Secretary Kenny MacAskill framed the move as a matter of law, not politics. Under Scottish legal tradition, compassion was not exoneration. It was, well, compassion in their eyes. However, the reaction was immediate and explosive. In the United States, outrage cut across party lines. Families of American victims called the release a betrayal. The White House condemned it. Newspapers ran photos of McGrahy receiving a hero's welcome in Tripoli. Crowds, flags, cheers. Images that hardened public anger and made nuance almost impossible. Across the Atlantic, Britain's Prime Minister David Cameron was infuriated by Scotland's decision. Then came the allegations. Documents later released under Freedom of Information law suggested that British officials had discussed McGrahy's case in parallel with negotiations over Libyan oil and gas contracts, including deals involving British Petroleum. The UK government denied any quid pro quo, insisting commercial interests played no role at all in the legal decision. Still, the timing fueled suspicion and distrust. Across the Atlantic, U.S. prosecutors quietly continued investigating alternative suspects. In 2015, former FBI Director James Comey stated the case was not closed. Then, in 2020,
tonight, a milestone in the prosecution of one of the deadliest acts of international
the U.S. formally
terrorism
charged
in
Abu
history.
Masoud, a Libyan intelligence operative, with constructing the explosive device which was hidden in that very Toshiba radio cassette player in the suitcase loaded onto Pan Am Flight 103. This is significant. And why? Because it opens up the real possibility that McGrahy was not alone, or possibly not even the central figure. The trial, after initial delays, has been set for April 20th, 2026. As for McGrahy himself, he lived nearly 3 years after his release, far longer than expected. He never withdrew his appeal. He never admitted guilt. He died in 2012, leaving behind a conviction, a cloud of doubt, and families still divided on whether justice had been served. Lockerbie is one of those rare events where every answer creates another question. And when certainty cracks and that very doubt settles in, something else rushes in to fill the void. Stories, theories, conspiracies, and whispers. Over the decade, Lockerbie has become a magnet for conspiracy. Some fringe, some rigorously investigated, and some emerging not from the internet, but from the very intelligence officers, investigators, and officials who handled the case. There are claims that the bomb wasn't Libyan at all, that it was Iranian retaliation executed by Palestinian militants. that CIA drug-running operations interfered with the investigation, that evidence was planted or selectively highlighted to serve geopolitical interests, and even that Pan Am Flight 103 was not the intended target. In Part 1, we followed the official path: the world before the blast, the night itself, the case that was built, the man who was convicted, and the cracks that formed beneath the weight of scrutiny. In Part 2, we step off that path. We'll explore the theories and the conspiracies that refuse to go away, the alternative suspects, the suppressed reports, the allegations governments still won't fully address, and we'll ask why, decades later, Lockerbie still feels unresolved. Because the most dangerous question isn't who did it, but rather, what happens when the story we're told is only possibly just a small part of that very truth. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Charles Denyer, and this is Threat Level Red.
Threat Level Red is a Charles Denyer Productions podcast. For more information, visit charlesdenyer.com to learn more about current and upcoming podcasts and episodes, current and future book publications, professional services offered by Charles, and much more. All opinions expressed are those of the host and do not reflect the official positions of any government agency, military branch, or national security organization.